Jack wasn't sure what hurt more, the gash on his arm, or the way the alien medic students were staring at him like he was already dead. He sat on the exam table, gripping his forearm where the jagged cut ran from his wrist to just below his elbow. It stung, but he'd had worse. The medical bay smelled oddly sterile, an unfamiliar tang in the air that probably came from whatever antiseptic these aliens used. The 4 students, each with different shades of mottled gray-green skin, stood frozen, their large dark eyes darting between Jack's face and the wound. The tallest one, who had introduced herself as Liren, cleared her throat with a wet click. Human Jack remained calm. "I am calm," Jack said, confused. "I just need a bandage." "We will do everything in our power to keep you comfortable in your final moments," another student, Velen, added solemnly. Jack blinked. "Final moments." Liren turned to the others. "We need to inform the supervising physician immediately. We may be able to preserve some of his tissues for study." Jack groaned. "Okay, hold on, nobody's preserving anything. It's just a cut." He lifted his arm slightly to show them, but that only made things worse. One of the students let out a distressed clicking sound and took a step back. "The dermal layer has been breached," one of them whispered. "Significant fluid loss will soon lead to systemic failure," another muttered. Jack exhaled slowly. "Guys, I am not dying. This is a minor injury. I just need it cleaned and wrapped up." Liren's brow furrowed. "You are losing blood." "Yes, that happens when you get cut, but humans have a lot of it. My body will replace what I've lost." The students exchanged glances. Velen hesitated before saying, "We have studied human anatomy, but we have never treated an actual human patient before. Your physiology is strange." Jack almost laughed but decided against it. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing more of his arm. "See this scar?" He pointed to a faded line near his elbow. "Got that when I was a kid. Fell off my bike. Didn't die." He moved his arm again. "And this one?" "Kitchen accident. Still here." The students were silent. Finally, Liren spoke. "You survived multiple dermal breaches." "Yes, because this isn't fatal." He gestured to his arm. "It'll heal on its own, but if you want to help, just clean it and put a bandage on it." The students huddled together, whispering. Jack caught snippets of their conversation: unusual regenerative properties, possible miscalculation in human fragility models. Should we still alert the physician? Finally, Liren turned back to him. "We are uncertain of the correct procedure. We will attempt to stabilize you, but if you begin to deteriorate, we must act quickly." Jack sighed. "Great. Let's get started then." They approached cautiously, as if he might collapse at any moment. Liren retrieved a medical device that looked like a cross between a scanner and a small multi-tool. "We will cleanse the wound first," she said, adjusting the settings. "This antiseptic solution is formulated for our species, but we believe it is safe for humans." Jack braced himself as she activated the device. A cool mist settled over his arm, then immediately burned. He winced, sucking in a sharp breath. Liren's eyes widened. "System failure beginning." Jack exhaled. "No, it just stings. That's normal." The students relaxed slightly, though they still looked uneasy. Velen stepped forward next, holding what appeared to be a thin, flexible patch. "This is an advanced wound covering. It seals injuries and promotes healing." Jack inspected the patch. "All right, that works. Just put it on." Velen carefully placed it over the cut, pressing along the edges. The material adhered instantly, and the stinging sensation dulled. Jack flexed his fingers. "See? Good as new." The students stared, waiting. "You!" Our stable Liren asked hesitantly. "Yes. You are not feeling." "Weaker." "Nope." Velen exhaled through his thin nostrils. "Incredible." Liren nodded. "We must document this. Human healing capabilities are greater than previously assumed." Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "I mean, it's not that special. People get hurt all the time and heal up just fine." Velen shook his head. "Your species is far more resilient than we expected. We were led to believe that any significant breach in the outer layer could be catastrophic. Jack chuckled. Well, it depends on how bad the injury is. But yeah, we can take a few hits. The students exchanged glances again. Liren hesitated before saying, "We would like to monitor your recovery process. For science." Jack sighed, but he couldn't help but smile. "Sure, just try not to act like I'm about to keel over every 5 minutes." The students nodded, though Jack wasn't convinced they wouldn't panic again at the next sign of trouble. Still, at least they were learning. Jack's forearm itched under the alien wound covering, but he resisted the urge to scratch it. The last thing he needed was to set off another round of frantic observations from the medical students. They were still watching him like he might suddenly drop dead, their dark eyes flicking between his face and his arm, as if expecting some delayed catastrophic reaction. Liren, the tallest of the group, finally broke the silence. "How does your body know how to repair itself?" Jack blinked at her. "What do you mean?" She motioned to his arm. "Your tissues were damaged. You stated that your body will replace what was lost. How does it know what to do?" Jack considered how best to explain. "Well, cells in my body detect the injury and start working to close the wound. Blood clots to stop the bleeding, new skin forms over time, and eventually adjust. Fixes itself." Velen looked skeptical. "Without external intervention?" "Most of the time, yeah," Jack confirmed. "Unless it's really bad. Then we might need stitches or surgery." The students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fascination. The shortest of the group, a quiet one named Rern, finally spoke. "Your species has internal repair mechanisms that function automatically." Jack nodded. "It's just biology." Liren made a thoughtful clicking noise. "Our species does not possess such rapid regenerative abilities. If we sustain an open wound, intervention is required immediately. Tissue cannot repair itself without precise medical assistance." Jack frowned. "So if you get a cut like mine and don't treat it, we would likely not survive," Velen admitted. "Our bodies do not regenerate lost tissue effectively, and infections set in quickly." Jack leaned back slightly, taking that in. "That explains a lot." Liren tilted her head. "You find this unusual?" "A little," Jack admitted. "I mean, I've always thought of healing as just something bodies do. It's weird to imagine not having that." Velen gestured toward the wound covering. "So you would not have required treatment at all?" Jack hesitated. "No, I still needed it cleaned and covered. Open wounds can get infected, even for humans. But the healing part, it just happens on its own." The students muttered amongst themselves again, their voices low and rapid. Jack caught snippets of words like biological advantage and unprecedented durability. He sighed. "Look, I'm not saying humans are invincible. We get sick, we break bones, we can absolutely be killed. It's just that small injuries like this aren't usually a big deal." Liren nodded slowly, but Jack could tell she was still processing the information. "You have experienced many such injuries?" Jack shrugged. "Yeah. I mean, growing up, you get scrapes and bruises all the time. It's normal." Rern's brow furrowed. "You experience frequent physical harm during development." Jack winced at how that sounded. Not intentionally, but yeah, kids run around, they fall, they bump into things. It's just part of life. Velen's expression darkened. "Your species exposes its young to environmental hazards." Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, we don't try to, but accidents happen." Liren's gaze was intense. "And this is considered normal?" Jack exhaled. "Yeah. Look, human bodies are built to handle some wear and tear. A scraped knee or a bruised elbow isn't a crisis. It's part of learning how to navigate the world." The students fell silent again, absorbing that. Finally, Rern spoke. "Your species is far more resilient than our data suggested." Jack shook his head. "I wouldn't say that. We just adapt to what we have to deal with." Liren tapped something into her datapad. "We must reassess our understanding of human medical needs." Jack rolled his shoulders. "Probably a good idea. Otherwise, you're going to give yourselves heart attacks every time one of us gets a paper cut." The students did not laugh. Instead, Velen frowned. A. Paper cut. Jack groaned. Oh boy. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. Liren straightened. We will continue to monitor your recovery process. Jack sighed but nodded. Fine. Just try not to act like I'm dying every time I sneeze. The students exchanged glances before cautiously nodding in agreement. Jack had a feeling this was going to be a long process. Jack wasn't sure if it was the sterile air of the medical bay or the 4 alien students watching his every move, but he was starting to feel like an overly complicated science experiment. Every time he so much as shifted in his seat, their dark eyes locked onto him, waiting for something, probably for his arm to fall off or for him to spontaneously combust. He sighed and rolled his shoulders. All right, I get that you guys are still figuring out human biology, but I promise, I'm not going to suddenly collapse. Liren nodded, but her expression remained wary. We understand that your condition appears stable, but we must ensure there are no delayed complications. Jack resisted the urge to rub his temples. There won't be. Rern, the quietest of the group, hesitated before stepping forward. We have been reviewing human case studies, he said. Your species has. Unusual responses to trauma. Jack raised a brow. Unusual how? Velen pulled up a holographic screen, scanning through notes. Some recorded cases indicate that humans continue functioning, even when sustaining injuries that should incapacitate them. He looked up, his face unreadable. There are reports of humans walking on broken limbs, continuing combat after severe lacerations, even remaining conscious despite significant internal damage. Jack sighed. Okay, see, that's not normal. That's adrenaline. Liren tilted her head. Adrenaline. Jack leaned forward slightly. It's a hormone. When we're in danger, our bodies release it, and it helps us push through pain or react quickly. But it's not like we don't feel the damage we do. It just gets overridden for a while. The students exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Velen tapped something on his datapad. This suggests that human pain response is not a reliable indicator of medical distress. Jack frowned. That's not exactly what I meant. We still feel pain, and it still matters. If someone's walking on a broken leg, it's not because they're fine, it's because they have no other choice. Liren's brow furrowed. That is concerning. Jack shrugged. It's not ideal, but it's just how we're wired. If we didn't have that response, we wouldn't survive dangerous situations. Velen tapped a clawed finger against his datapad. Your species prioritizes survival even at the cost of immediate health. Jack hesitated. I guess? It's not really a conscious choice. It's just biology. Vern's dark eyes flicked to Jack's bandaged arm. Then how do you determine when an injury is severe enough to require intervention? Jack exhaled. Experience mostly. We learn to recognize when something is serious. If the pain is too much, if we can't move properly, if there's too much bleeding, those are all signs we need help. Liren's jaw tightened. But you stated that pain can be overridden. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, which is why people sometimes don't realize how bad they're hurt until the adrenaline wears off. The students glanced at each other again, the tension in the room thickening. Jack could tell they were struggling to reconcile what they had learned with what they had assumed about human fragility. Velen finally spoke. This makes treating human patients difficult. If your species does not always recognize its own limits, how can we ensure proper care? Jack sighed. Look, as long as you listen when a human tells you they're hurt, you'll be fine. Most of us aren't trying to push through injuries unless we have to. Liren frowned. But your species is capable of doing so. Jack hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, but just because we can doesn't mean we should. The students were silent for a long moment. Finally, Rern spoke again. We must adjust our approach to human patients. Jack smirked. Probably a good idea. Liren studied him for a moment before nodding. We will continue monitoring your recovery. Jack groaned. Of course you will. The students didn't react to his frustration, but Jack figured that was probably for the best. At least they were learning. Jack had accepted, reluctantly, that the alien medical students were going to hover around him until they were fully convinced he wasn't going to drop dead from what amounted to a glorified scratch. Their curiosity was understandable, even if their intensity made him feel like a particularly fragile specimen under a microscope. He could deal with it mostly. The problem was that they weren't just observing anymore. They were testing theories. Velen, who had been the most skeptical of Jack's insistence that he was fine, had pulled out a series of diagnostic tools and started scanning him at different intervals. Liren was recording notes on a datapad, occasionally stopping to ask questions that made Jack feel like he was in some kind of bizarre medical interview. Arn and the last student, a quiet one named Ulrin, were debating something in hushed voices, occasionally glancing at Jack's arm like it might provide them with answers if they stared hard enough. Jack exhaled, trying to be patient. "All right, what's the latest theory? Because you all look like you've just discovered fire for the first time." Liren glanced up from her notes. "We are attempting to determine the exact rate of your tissue regeneration." Jack blinked. "You mean how fast I heal?" "Yes," Velen said, adjusting his scanner. "We have documented the initial state of the injury and are now comparing it to its current state to assess progress." Jack resisted the urge to roll his eyes. You could just wait a few days and check then." Liren frowned. "That would be inefficient. If we can determine a pattern now, we can better estimate human healing rates for future reference." Jack sighed. "Fine. What's the verdict so far?" Velen hesitated before glancing at his scanner. The damaged tissue is already beginning to repair itself. Jack nodded. "Yeah, that's normal." Rern looked up from his notes. "It has been less than a standard cycle. Your body has already begun reconstruction." Jack shrugged. "Yeah, it's not like I'm regrowing a limb or anything, but small wounds start closing up pretty quickly." Ulrin, who had been silent for most of the interaction, finally spoke. "This is unusual." Jack frowned. "For you, maybe. For humans, it's just how it works." Liren tapped her datapad. "Your body does not require external stimulation to trigger this process." "Nope. It just does it on its own." The students exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Jack could practically hear the calculations running through their heads. Velen finally spoke. "We have been trained to assume that biological recovery requires active intervention, that even minor injuries, if untreated, could result in significant deterioration." Jack scratched his head. "So what do you guys do if you get a small cut? One that is smaller than mine?" Liren straightened. "Immediate medical attention is required. A wound left untreated would not heal on its own." Jack frowned. "Wait, at all?" "No," Velen confirmed. "Our species lacks autonomous cellular regeneration. Medical intervention is always necessary." Jack exhaled. "Okay, yeah, that explains why you all panicked when you saw my arm." Liren nodded. "We assumed the prognosis was dire." Jack rubbed his forehead. "Well, I appreciate the concern, but I promise this is nothing. I'll be fine." The students didn't look entirely convinced, but they were at least no longer acting like he was on the verge of collapse. Arn hesitated before speaking again. "Are there limits to this process? At what point does a human require external assistance?" Jack thought about it. "I mean, if the wound is too deep, if it won't close on its own, or if there's something inside that needs to be removed, that's when we step in with stitches or surgery." Velen made a note. "And if such intervention is not provided?" Jack's expression darkened slightly. "Then the wound can get infected, or it won't close properly. In worst cases, it can be fatal." The students were silent, processing that information. Liren finally spoke. "So while your species possesses natural recovery abilities, it is not without risk." Jack nodded. "Exactly. We still need medical care in serious situations. It's not like we're unbreakable." Ulrin, who had been deep in thought, finally looked up. Your species compensates for its physical vulnerability by enduring injuries that would incapacitate others and recovering autonomously when possible. Jack hesitated before nodding. I guess you could look at it that way. Liren sighed, glancing at her notes. This requires substantial revision to our understanding of human resilience. Jack smirked. Glad to be your test subject. Velen gave him a serious look. You have provided invaluable data. Liren straightened. We will continue monitoring your progress. Jack groaned. Of course you will. The students nodded in unison. Jack sighed. It was going to be a long few days. Jack had thought, naively, that once the alien medical students saw that he wasn't about to keel over from his minor injury, they would let him go. He had underestimated their commitment to scientific observation. They were still watching him. Liren and Velen had stationed themselves near the medical bay's central console, logging data at regular intervals. Rarn had taken to periodically checking the wound covering, carefully lifting the edges to examine the healing progress. Orin, the quietest of the group, had been staring at Jack's hand for the past 10 minutes with an unreadable expression. Jack sighed. All right, I have to ask, what now? Orin blinked. You are moving your fingers. Jack flexed his fingers experimentally. Yeah. There was structural damage along your forearm, Orin said, his voice measured. Yet you retain full dexterity. Jack frowned. It wasn't that deep. Just a cut. Liren looked up from her datapad. We were uncertain whether such an injury would impair function. Jack groaned. Guys, if I'd actually cut a tendon or something, yeah, that would be a problem. But this? Barely more than a scratch. Velen exhaled. This confirms that human extremities remain operational despite dermal compromise. Jack rubbed his temples. You're making it sound a lot more dramatic than it is. Rarn hesitated. We are attempting to adjust our medical framework for human patients. There was significant debate over whether minor trauma would cause cascading failure. Jack stared at them. Cascading failure. If one system fails, others may follow, Liren explained, as if this were obvious. In our species, even small injuries can lead to deterioration if not treated immediately. We had no reference for how human physiology would respond. Jack exhaled. Well, now you know. Human bodies are pretty good at keeping themselves running unless something major happens. Velen nodded, making another entry in his notes. This knowledge will be valuable in future interactions. Jack stretched his arm out experimentally. Great. So does that mean I can leave now? The students hesitated. Jack caught the brief, uncertain glance that passed between them. Liren cleared her throat. We would like to conduct one final assessment. Jack groaned. Of course you would. Orin stepped forward, holding a small handheld device. This will scan for residual damage. If the results confirm full stability, you will be cleared. Jack sat back and held out his arm. Fine. Let's get this over with. Orin activated the scanner, running it slowly over Jack's forearm. A soft hum filled the air as the device processed data. The medical students leaned in, watching intently as the results flashed across the screen. After a few moments, Orin turned the device toward the others. No abnormalities detected. Liren exhaled. Then he is indeed recovering without issue. Velen nodded. This is conclusive. Jack smirked. Told you. Rarn hesitated before stepping back. We acknowledge that our previous assumptions were incorrect. Jack gave them a lopsided grin. Hey, no harm done. Well, except to my arm, but that's already fixing itself. Liren straightened. We will update our medical protocols accordingly. Future human patients will not be subjected to unnecessary distress. Jack chuckled. That's all I can ask for. The tension in the room finally eased. The students still looked thoughtful, but the rigid anxiety they had carried earlier had faded. Velen deactivated his datapad. You are free to go. Jack stood, rolling his shoulder. Finally, No offense, but being the subject of a medical mystery is not my idea of a fun afternoon. Ulrin inclined his head. You have provided invaluable data. Jack grinned. Glad to be of service. Just don't panic if the next human who comes through here has a bruise or something, okay? Lirin gave him a serious nod. We will adjust our response accordingly. Jack smirked and gave them a lazy salute. See you around, doctors in training? As he walked out of the medical bay, he could still feel their eyes on him, but this time, it wasn't because they thought he was dying. It was because they had learned something new, and Jack figured that was a pretty good way to wrap things up.